Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Welcome to the China Desk Podcast. I'm your host, Steve Yates, Senior Fellow at the America First Policy Institute and Chair of the China Policy Initiative. A reminder that viewers can watch the China Desk on YouTube, and the listeners can subscribe to hear all of our interviews on Apple, Google, Spotify, and most other podcast providers. As always, you can access our podcasts at thefederalnewswire.com. My guest today is Christian Whiton, former State Department senior advisor in the Bush and Trump administrations, and currently a senior fellow at the Center for the National Interest. Christian also is the author of the book Smart Power Between Diplomacy and War, which will be at the heart of today's discussion about China. Christian, welcome to the China Desk. Let's jump in on Smart Power, and please share a little bit of background of what brought you into the book, what its core kind of ideas and concepts were, and then let's dive further after that into how it applies to China.
Great. Well, thanks, Steve, for having me on. Smart power is something I thought about a lot when I was working at the State Department the first time in the Bush administration, where it seemed that the dialogue often came down to either you're going to use the extremes of statecraft, of either full kinetic warfare or just talk. Not diplomacy, which can involve a lot more, but just talk. And it was sort of one or the other, or economics. It was either do nothing or go to sort of a full court press of tariffs and disengagement. And as I thought about it, and in an attempt to be a student of history and diplomatic history and the history of statecraft, it seems like there are a lot of things you can do between those two extremes. You can apply economic measures, including tariffs, which I mentioned, but other measures, especially if you're the United States, and for the time being, hold the reserve currency that the world uses for international trade. You can use things like foreign assistance. You can use things like political warfare, which I would argue is something we used to be particularly good at as a country. In fact, the document that brought our country into existence, the Declaration of Independence, could be described as an act of political warfare that was intended more to affect political conditions as opposed to, achieving something on the battlefield, and a number of other steps that you can use to influence events abroad to the advantage of the United States, and that, in fact, we would recognize throughout most of our history, even though we were taught in high school. Who knows what they're teaching today? Is the sort of series of U.S. wars that have occurred. We seem to win them all up until the Department of Defense was created, after which we seem to either tie or lose them all. That's a separate issue. But that bringing to bear that full spectrum of statecraft is what you need to do, especially if you're managing an adversary like China. And you see this into the discussion today, I think, with just Vassal a little bit, where it's become focused on Taiwan. And there are people like you, Steve, who for decades have been stressing the importance of Taiwan. Taiwan is an asset. And we're happy that we have this level of attention now, but there's so much more that China is doing to our disadvantage, to its own advantage. And it's such a bigger issue than just whether or not you're going to have war in the Taiwan Strait, which is now everyone's questions. When is China going to invade? When is China going to invade? And in fact, we are in a much bigger and more complicated conflict. So that's sort of what I was trying to get at with the idea of smart power.
Well, that's a perfect entryway into the conversation we want to have today. Let's look a little bit at two of the big practitioners of this political warfare concept that you outlined in the book and have talked about for many, many years. One positive example that you've cited in the book is what our ally Great Britain did rather well during previous periods. And there are some lessons to learn from that. And on the sort of evil side of the ledger, I would argue the Communist Party of China has done a brilliant job of political warfare from its foundation forward. It's obviously brutalized its people. It's made many, many mistakes. But as an instrument of political warfare, it has been wildly fine-tuned and now internationalized in ways we've never really seen. So if you could talk a little bit about the concept that you drew upon in the book on political warfare, the positive winning side of the equation with the historical example of Great Britain, lessons we should learn from that. And then we'll jump back into the China bad, how they're doing things now and what we ought to be doing to respond.
Right. Well, in World War II, Britain had a full-blown political warfare executive. It sat alongside the Special Operations Executive, which was more sabotage, infiltration, things like that. But it came down to what was high tech at the time, which was radio broadcasting. And this, unfortunately, is something that, for better or worse, probably for worse, still dominates a lot of our thinking. But it was very innovative at the time. So you had white broadcasting, which was official over, just non-clandestine broadcast. So, hello, this is London. We're broadcasting here as whichever king or government was deposed by the Nazis, who's head of the government in exile here in London, who has a message for you. But you also had black broadcasts or gray broadcasts. The distinction varies depending on who you're speaking to. But basically, sometimes you'd be broadcasting from outside an occupied territory, saying that you were inside that territory. Sometimes you'd talk up the resistance. Sometimes that would be factual information. Sometimes it would be an exaggeration. And there were other elements of it during the war. Of course, Tokyo Rose is famous for what the Japanese were doing directed at U.S. forces in the Pacific. It was pretty ham-fisted. And the United States created the Voice of America during the war. Over time, and you have experience with this, some of those government tools, especially VOA, have atrophied, and the U.S. government has sort of said, okay, we're still going to do the radio, but it's going to be internet, and we're also going to try a bunch of like social media stuff, which, as you'd expect from a government program, isn't really a finely tuned machine. And we've sort of lost track, I think, of the bigger picture, which is how do I put my opponent on the back foot? Sometimes that involves putting my own best foot forward to explaining, hey, isn't America great? That seems to be controversial in the US now. But when we have problems, and we do, we actually can resolve them. We can improve them. We have a representative government. We have a government that's accountable to the people. We are part of this experiment that started 250 years ago that's been one of the greatest liberators. So sometimes it's that, but sometimes it's also accentuating the bad parts of what your adversary is doing. And sometimes you do it with accreditation, where you say, hey, we're the US government, or we're this non-governmental organization in the US doing this. Other times you do it, less directly. But it's not just information and news and broadcasting, which is important. It's also, what your government does, what your State Department and DOD diplomats are saying, what they're assuming. Are they, of the mindset that the CCP is going to sort of be there forever, and that we may need to get tougher on it, but that it is something like the weather that's just going to be there? Or is it something we can influence? Is it something that we can hope goes away? And also what your companies do. So again, I would say it's, we've had some great examples. The Brits did well. One other quick one I'll throw out, if I could, is the best act of political warfare in history was a pretty minor one. It's there were in World War I people in Russia who were against the Russian monarchy, but who rallied around the flag when World War I came. And as it turns out, there was a guy named Lenin hanging out in Switzerland who said, no. Your duty is to your class, and we should not care about who wins that war. We should get out of that war, and we should stage revolution. Well, this was a very helpful message for the Germans, so the Germans saw to it that man Lenin got put on a special train, moved across Germany, and showed up in Russia, and the rest is history. That sort of thinking of how you make life hard for our adversaries.
Yeah, well, it seems to be at its core is, can I get into the head of my adversary? And once there, what can I do to maybe make myself get ahead by drawing him down, or at least sowing doubt and confusion or what have you? There are, as you cite, some important examples of this. There probably are several examples we could go through of where we have fallen victim to this. Anybody that has gotten involved in spy versus spy kind of investigations over the years, you have everything from the honey trap to the money trap to all kinds of ways that you get into the life in a controlling way of a target. And for whatever reason, as your book points out, this kind of craft, which has existed for as long as mankind practically, has been put to the wayside as somehow not relevant and valuable. And yet one of our key adversaries in the world today, the Chinese Communist Party, never put it down and has used it against its own people, has used it against our diplomats and leaders, and is currently doing a very, very fine job of engaging in political warfare in the current affairs that are in breaking news today. So let's jump a little bit into that. When we talk about China policy here at the China Desk, we're usually talking not just about what would be in memos at the State Department or the minutes of the next meeting. We're talking about what's being done to our culture, our civilization, basically sowing division and dissent in America. In your observation, having looked at this, how would you assess the efficacy of China's efforts to use smart power, and in what ways do you think the everyday audience could see it in their real lives?
I think it was very effective and has been and continues to be Beijing's use of smart power, political warfare against the United States, starting with a long period where at the United Nations, back when that was a little more relevant, not much, a little, where they essentially just abstained from everything. They were a member of the Security Council, but not a particularly active one. Often the contentious points between the United States and Russia or the United States and France, really having done a great job. That's just one example of convincing people that they're not that much of a threat. And this was, of course, critical in the 1990s. And of course, the CCP was different in the 1990s. Xi Jinping was not in charge. I think it was probably a worthy experiment to see if economic liberalization would lead to political liberalization. Some of the skeptics of the 1997 handover of Hong Kong to China, who since have been vindicated, were a little bit, I think, surprised at the duration of time where China did follow some of its promises in Hong Kong. And we saw that here with the infiltration of American universities, of corporations, the accusation of anyone who is skeptical of China of having a Cold War mindset. More recently, this is sort of compounded into, oh, you're racist against Chinese Americans, or you can't be racist, so you better watch out and not criticize China too much. You saw differing degrees of this. Also, the fact that the way they've collected information, they sort of got caught stealing from U.S. Department of Energy labs, nuclear weapons designs in the late 90s. And there have been rumors, of course, of very unfortunately successful counterintelligence operations by the Chinese against U.S. intelligence sources within China. It's been a little different with them than with the Soviet Union. It wasn't sort of the operation of nefarious, obvious sort of communist cells, the way the Soviets did, where you had people like Whittaker Chambers who came over and confessed what had happened and shed light on this. It's more subtle. It's less deep penetration of the U.S. government with sleeper agents who are ideologically motivated or who have been cultivated because they're disgruntled. So instead of a small number of high-level sources, it's thousands and thousands of people at think tanks, at universities, at corporations, some of which think that, some of whom probably know they're working for the Chinese, and some of whom may not, or may just think that the grant they got or the favor that they had paid was just because they're a great person. But long story short is that it's been a subtle but comprehensive mechanism. And we see it today, even today with Congress, really, I think, making a significant turn since 2016 to recognizing China as an adversary. It still hasn't led to a significantly increased military defense posture in the Pacific.
Yeah, that's actually an important point where we talk about political warfare. It's just one piece of the pie, and it leads somewhere. And while China definitely under the Communist Party leads with political warfare, it does vacuum up a vast amount of technology and wealth and invests it in hard power, military capabilities, and hard positions in all the institutions around the world to insulate itself, but also to turn the tables against us or anyone else when someone needs to have a vote go one way or the other. One of the key areas where they did that was with the COVID-19 virus. Obviously, we have conversations today that if we rewound back 3 years, we had conversations then, but they got stepped on by fact checkers and censors for a period of time. And one could argue, perhaps, that the political warfare that Beijing was practicing fed directly into some of those steps. After all, they were able to lie about where the virus came from. They were able to lie about its transmissibility. They were able to export lockdown policies that they said would block transmission, which turns out to be a lie. They were able to co-opt international organizations that well-meaning Westerners turned to as sources of legitimate counsel on health, and were able, by way of those co-opted organizations, to pressure us. And then they obviously fed the fuel of political division in the United States about how we saw culpability for the outbreak and the response to the outbreak. In many, many ways, I would argue that is possibly the greatest current example of political warfare. It had tremendous consequences of taking down the United States economically for a time, dividing the United States profoundly in ways perhaps we are beginning to heal from, but no evidence quite yet. And in some ways, we still don't have anyone laying a glove on China. And so it's a perfect example of what you organized as the core concept in your book of they have completely insulated themselves. We are not turning the table and making them have to answer tough questions at home, sowing division or doubt at home. We were completely on the defensive for the last 3 years, only to their advantage. So outside of the COVID situation, what would be some of the other areas of policy that you think would be examples that we need to get smarter about, whether it's in Congress, as we have a new select committee on the CCP, or in an administration, if we're willing to listen, what could reasonably be done out of a White House, a State Department, or a whole of government approach?
Right. Well, I think, first of all, you make a good point that smart power can't exist just in a vacuum without military power. If Ronald Reagan had said, tear down this wall, if he had said that Marxism, Leninism would be, or at least the Soviet version, would be consigned to the ash heap of history, if he had given support to Polish solidarity, which was contesting the dominance of the communist state in Poland, without actually building up the U.S. military, then the Cold War probably wouldn't have ended, or wouldn't have ended on terms that were as advantageous and pro-freedom as they were. So it's, and this is something some of our diplomats get and others don't, which is that their words are given meaning and power in part by the U.S. military and its presence, and in part by the U.S. economy. And it's important to keep that in mind. I mean, if you look at 1989 and 1991, these tremendous breakthroughs, and particularly 1989, before the 90 recession, which was actually pretty mild. I mean, you had 7 fat years of economic growth and a complete reversal, the narrative decline in the US and Great Britain, that we were past our prime, that we were, involved in all of these cultural and economic problems that were intractable. And so as far as truly beating China, it's not just doing a number of things right. It's also, it's getting things right in the United States. I think that is, that's important. Another important thing, though, is again that sort of narrative and framing of assumptions. So it's amazing to me. It's almost cut and paste when you read an article from much of the media about Taiwan. It sort of says, it always includes a sentence that China considers Taiwan a renegade province and has not ruled out reunification by force. I mean, that's Orwellian. What that is a big communist dictatorship threatening to invade a peaceful, democratic nation that is, a blind man could tell is a different nation than China, even if some of our diplomats cannot do. So getting that right and getting deterrence right, too. You mentioned the China Committee, Representative Mike Gallagher was over in Taiwan, pointed out there's a huge backlog of arms that Taiwan has purchased, $19 billion worth, that haven't been delivered. I think a lot of those are going to Ukraine. Others could just be held up here by bureaucracy. There's this famous, annoying game where the Taiwanese are forced to ask permission permission. They can't just say, okay, we want to buy these arms. Here's our request. They sort of have to go to this thing over in Roslyn, Virginia, called the American Institute in Taipei or Taiwan, and say, well, we're thinking about this. And then they're going to waste a few months being talked down on that, really getting into a more serious mindset of deterrence and backfooting our opponents.
Yeah, so I think that's actually a perfect example of dumb power, where we actually lead from behind and delay and allow bureaucracy to give something that might be meaningful, death by a thousand cuts. And it is a bit baffling how the United States would want to take somewhat of a cautious approach toward promising intervention on behalf of an ally or partner overseas, but wanting to kind of put a straitjacket on them to hold them back from having the best, most modern deterrent capability. You'd think it would be common sense, and I think most Americans would be shocked to learn that we only sell less than top tier things to our allies that are supposed to stand up to this Chinese power that has risen largely on the backs of U.S. consumerism, us opening up the welcome mat to have them come to our markets, come to our communities, and make them a manufacturing platform. And oh, by the way, transfer the most advanced technology and make us dependent upon them. So in a way, we've done almost everything wrong to set up the stage for effective political warfare to be able to dissuade an enemy or have them turn within rather than see opportunity without. And I think that's actually plays directly into the Chinese Communist Party's playbook. It's a truism. Every China expert supposedly knows that when there are problems inside China, the Communist Party will kick up some dust in another area to use nationalism as the salve to distract its public away from the bad deal they've been given in their social compact, and wrap themselves around pride in the nation and trying to push back against the evil Uncle Sam bully or whatever the demon of the day is. And in some ways, our policy posture over the last half century has played right into that. We started to change pieces of it. So maybe let's talk a little bit about the things that are changing and why. We had, with the 2016 election, for the first time, the bipartisan consensus on the free trade theory, I would say, was challenged. We had both major political party conventions with anti-Trans-Pacific Partnership signs on full display. When the Trump administration came in, my friend Bob Lighthizer at the America First Policy Institute was U.S. trade representative and made tariffs fashionable again, and began talking about wild notions like balanced trade and reciprocity and accountability in the trade policy realm. So we had somewhat this turn on trade. There have been flares that have gone up to warn about communications networks being clean or compromised and supply chains being clean or compromised when it came to semiconductors or other advanced technology. We had several departments of the administration come out with reports talking about the threat the Chinese Communist Party presents in the United States, from the Justice Department to the Department of Homeland Security. We had Vice President Pence at the time, I think for the first time, a senior White House elected leader talking about the threat the Communist Party plays inside the United States. So we had a beginning of that turn, but maybe share with us your sense of how much that turn has continued or had some momentum kind of curbed by the pandemic, perhaps, and what parts might be ripe for revival or rejuvenation at this point.
Right. It seems to it's pretty slow. It's pretty stunted. There was this big change in 2016 related both to trade, although the Trump administration, certainly the president talked tough at times with China, but actually people who were negotiating the trade agreements, they said they had an easier time with Canada and Mexico because Trump was willing to walk away from those, almost wanted NAFTA to go away and not be replaced with anything. So our negotiators could say to Canada and Mexico, excuse me, that listen, you really need to sign this agreement because the alternative is not something more advantageous to you. The alternative is nothing. With China, because Trump kept saying he was going to get a deal, that actually gave more power to the Chinese negotiators, and he got the so-called Phase 1 trade agreement. The implication was it's just a start. The Chinese who came over to sign it came from a country they knew had a spreading virus and didn't bother telling the administration that. And it was essentially put aside because of COVID and just this idea that, well, the supply chain is in such complete disarray. We're not going to end any of the tariffs that were put in place in order to get China to the negotiating table. So if you go forward to the Biden administration, somewhat to their credit, they haven't, and this was a possibility, eliminated the 25% tariffs that Trump put on about half of what's imported from China. But he hasn't really gone farther than that. And they talked up that they were going to produce a big China policy, make it clear, and that's something the administration has not done. We haven't had an explanation from the Secretary of State or Defense, or I think it would actually warrant hearing from the president himself what the policy is on China. And if you look at the Cold War, a lot of people date the start of that either to 1947 or 1945. Very definitively, President Truman and his administration had started to make clear what our policies were, both internally within the U.S. government and externally. And we are farther into this conflict with China. Frankly, now it's a cold conflict. That's a good thing, but hopefully it doesn't become a hot one without a clear explanation. You mentioned Bob Lighthizer, who's talked up strategic decoupling. That makes a lot of sense. So it's not that we're going to have an immediate traumatic break with China, which would be hard since we're so dependent on them for a lot of things. But over time, and hopefully it's not a lot of time, we could shift away. That incidentally would feed into smart power or smart diplomacy, because shifting manufacturing out of China would be great if we could get some here in the United States, but probably go elsewhere in Southeast Asia, which is another element here. It's areas of contest, and then the obvious one during the Cold War was Western Europe or in the Eastern Bloc. And now it's in a way broader. Part of it is here in the homeland because China is waging extensive political warfare here. That political warfare is dangerous. It's not as ideologically driven as communism and Soviet communism was in its heyday in the 1930s here, but because of its economic resources, it's more sinister here. But looking at all of these things, tying them all together, is just something that the administration hasn't done. And the Gallagher Committee, the China Committee, had its first hearing a couple of days ago. That's terrific. They did a good job. There was bipartisan support. It was a more interesting hearing than almost anything that has come out of Congress since the last Supreme Court confirmation. But it's very difficult for Congress to actually establish a foreign policy. We really do need to hear it from a president. And Joe Biden, there's still time if he wants to tighten one up, especially after this attention after the balloon. But it may sort of actually have to come down to a presidential campaign when policies typically are honed and explained to the people.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. You talked about the role that having a defined policy toward the Soviet Union was expected and in many ways a prerequisite to be taken seriously as a presidential contender from every election from World War II up until the end of what people see as the end of the Cold War. I might argue the Cold War didn't actually end. The Soviet Union kind of dissolved, but there's still some pretty big communist parties out there doing some pretty bad things. And we may have declared preemptive or victory and maybe turned a blind eye to a growing bigger threat. Topic for another day. But we have never really had this litmus test challenge of, if you're going to be taken seriously as a presidential contender, do you have a believable, comprehensive strategy for how you would contain the malign influences of the Communist Party of China? How would you engage in that kind of deterrence and influence without provoking a war? And how do you talk about the nature of this threat without sounding defeatist? but giving a vision for how we can and will overcome if we do the right things with the right people. And if the Chinese people are left to suffer under the Communist Party longer, that's a travesty, but it's even bigger travesty for the world if that continues and we allow them to just erode our pillars of freedom and a constitutional republic here. So if we look then at where things may go over the next year or two, there's a lot of activism in states. There are things that perhaps where the federal government is not leading, that governors and legislators, or maybe we look even beyond government to private sector. And what are some of the things that, absent a president jumping in and giving a clear vision, grounded on real power from military deterrent, revived economy, etc. What are some things that people who are outside of the swamp, quote unquote, could do to build a foundation for better options for future leaders on this regard?
Yeah, it's hard to do. Sometimes you do need the resources of government. If you're talking about pumping information into a place like North Korea, I have a little experience with that myself. It's not like you can do that by selling advertising or subscriptions. So you need someone to pay. Who's going to pay? It's often going to come down to government, but certainly corporations could get involved, foundations, things like that, and they could start by reversing the harm they are doing. Once I was talking to, I'll call the head of a Fortune 10 company, the CEO, who said, I just don't know anyone. You just have to have a plan to do business in China today. And his company was one that frankly had very little to do and didn't have to have anything to do with China. And if it did have a lot to do with China, wouldn't affect its top or bottom line particularly much. Having gotten away from that, corporations, finance, manufacturing, and it runs the spectrum. I mean, Elon Musk has said and done some very interesting things and been cheered on by conservatives recently. The man still is out of a company that has a giant manufacturing facility in China, and that's considered the high-tech, leading-edge part of the automotive business. Boeing was talking up the partnership it has with China's big aircraft manufacturing as recently as November. You have, of course, American finance still chasing Lucy's football, if you will, in China. So those are some things that could change on their own without government forcing them to change. And, everyone says, well, this is just too big of a market. It's 1.4 billion people. But first of all, there's a long experience of China not letting companies get ahead or get a dominant position or a strong position if they're foreign. The Communist Party is just in on the joke. Everyone in Chinese business is in on the joke. They know that doesn't happen. And there's a big world elsewhere to focus resources. The other thing that individuals can do is just bring attention and bring pressure on positive news stories and negative news stories that influence the situation. Negative things like what's going on in Hong Kong, the trial of 47 people, people like Cardinal Zen, this elderly, retired Catholic official who, just says very simple things about in favor of democracy and keeping promises and has the Chinese government terrified. Jimmy Lai, publisher that China has locked up because he ran a pro-democracy newspaper that was very, very popular in Hong Kong. That's sort of emphasizing the negative stuff, that those people are being persecuted and there's not that much the West is doing about it. And then the positive part, like Taiwan, which is that Taiwan is actually an asset, or should be, or can be, because it's an example of what free, ethnically Chinese, for the most part, people can accomplish. So this idea isn't, this is just something terrible with the CCP. We have to manage it. Who knows what happens if it goes away? Well, there's this positive part of it. Could you imagine if China actually did have the rule of law and an accountable government?
Yeah. Well, let's dive into a couple of sectors that I think maybe are areas where, if the feds aren't going in the right direction, there could be some things done at the states or pressure from the grassroots up to right things over the course of coming national campaigns. One is in tech and the other is in energy and natural resources. First on tech, that was a topic that former Deputy National Security Advisor Matthew Pottinger highlighted in the Q&A in the Select Committee on the CCP hearing. He was talking about how some of the big social media and tech companies are blocked from doing business in China. And so they should be natural allies to work with among the free world or the responsible, transparent, accountable world to build an alternative platform, an alternative ecosystem. What do you make of what Matt was talking about in that area? Is tech a potential area of promise to steer this ship back in the right direction?
It should be, but and this is where I differ from those who are sort of free markets and will cure everything, because tech does need to be pushed in that direction. Silicon Valley has been very much in bed with China again. They sort of the allure of this huge market of growing affluence, if you get too deep into China, if you dip a toe in, you're going to lose your code, you're going to lose access or like essentially lose ownership to your intellectual property. It may still technically be yours, but it's theirs. The idea that these companies haven't, because they are unable to operate freely in China, or because they're censored heavily when they hit sensitive topics, and there are a lot of those that the CCP thinks is sensitive, why haven't they said, okay, well, let's focus on the other 6 billion people on Earth? It's somewhat of a mystery. I think it goes to the monoculture of Silicon Valley, and a lack of knowledge. It also comes from, frankly, a lot of reliance on Chinese immigrants who are involved in engineering and things like that. Even if I'm sure a great majority of them are just doing their jobs, but that has also been a source of technological information for Beijing. So parting with that pool of talent that they've sort of been cultivating or gotten used to, universities go into this category too. Either they're getting grants indirectly from China, sometimes directly, but probably indirectly through, thinly veiled sources that are Chinese, or whether it's Chinese citizens who are paying full ride at universities, often displacing Asian Americans, because even though universities say they don't have quotas, a lot of them do. That will take, I think, more government pushing to get tech to see the light and get out of that.
Yeah, well, I wish it were a happier story, but I can't disagree with your diagnosis of the situation. On energy and natural resources, of course, a lot of that has regulation and control from the federal level. But I think most people looked at the time when we had temporarily achieved energy independence, or what was called energy independence. We still imported a lot, but we had the capability to produce a great deal here. And it allowed for better options in what had been a long and troubled region in the broader Middle East. And some big policy changes could be tried by getting that energy independence right. When we look at China, we don't have that energy dependence relationship with China, but they have a near lock on refining capabilities. And so even if we got our leadership around to the idea that the Creator has blessed us with this endowment of a great amount of energy from not just coal and oil and natural gas, but a lot of other valuable minerals, even if we got to building those mines and we were committed to achieving that energy independence, we'd still be shipping a lot of these things across the Pacific twice to get refined and come back here. Do you see room in that area that a new Congress or maybe an entrepreneurial governor could start pushing the envelope to challenge this as they await a federal government that wakes up to the reality that this energy being drawn out of American resources, refined by Americans, and supplying the world would actually be cleaner and more efficient and would probably make the world much more stable and prosperous?
Yeah, well, on this issue, I'm in the minority, Steve, in that I think the best thing Congress and the administration can do, which they're not going to do, incidentally, is drop or find a way to cut a deal with Russia and drop sanctions on Russian energy. The last 2 years have been a huge benefit to China, not just because the United States has made it harder to produce hydrocarbons here in the United States, even though we have this abundance and we have this ability to continue a transformation into natural gas, which is less carbon intensive. So if you're up at night worrying about carbon intensity in the environment and the 4% of the carbon cycle that can be tracked back to human activity, that's something you'd think you'd encourage domestically that we're not. But China already imports a significant amount of natural gas. There's a pipeline called Power of Siberia, and they're laying additional pipelines either directly from Russia to China or across Mongolia. But the sanctions we've put on Russia have given huge discounts for those who are still willing to buy Russian oil. And it's not just Russia, it's Russia and India and other companies in the countries in the global south. But it's a year into the war. We might ask ourselves, is this really having the effect on Russia's economy and military? And what's it doing for China, making it, giving it such a great deal? You'd think the Chinese, being paranoid and seeing the same Russia that we do, would be concerned about becoming increasingly reliant on Russian gas. But especially now, as we see China contemplate providing arms to Russia, that they probably have confidence, especially with their accumulated capital, that they could play a dominant role in that relationship, and that adding Russian gas is going to be beneficial. So, it would be nice to get out of that, to stop giving China the big discount on oil and to shift back to production here. It's just going to take time to do that. And also you need just sort of like having a clear China policy, you need an energy policy, because especially with LNG, if you're going to invest in the pipelines and the terminals and the ships, or with refineries, which are very capital intensive, you have to have some confidence that we're not going to have politicians in this country that want to kill your business, that you're going to have, you need a 30-year runway for a natural gas project from beginning to end.
And the same could be said in the nuclear field too, where we have limited ourselves for no apparent good reason. And the Chinese have been running at light speed ahead in developing small modular reactors and other kinds of nuclear power prospects for themselves. So this is another area where, when you look at the challenge that China under the Communist Party presents us, it isn't just a military attack on Taiwan, or missiles that could land in Alaska, Hawaii, or our West, or a clash in another part of the world where an increasingly large Chinese Navy comes head to head, so to speak, with Americans out on patrol. We have always had those kinds of risks. But now the Chinese Communist Party has seemingly found ways to tip the balance on manufacturing and the economy, energy that makes our life go, education in terms of getting universities and their leaderships hooked on the sugar of the infusion of mass amounts of capital from China, students from China, experts from China, and access to China. And so we face this comprehensive challenge, I think, in ways that the Soviet Union could only have dreamt of. Thankfully, Al-Qaeda and its ilk could never find a way to embed itself as deeply into our livelihoods as the Chinese Communist Party has. But I think we're just at the very beginning, not the middle, certainly not at the end, at getting our awareness right, much less our policy right. When we look at sort of the parting shots of how do we look at what your experience was in 2 tours at the State Department, developing and talking about your book, Smart Power, and this concept of political warfare, its importance, very underutilized tool that Americans should excel at. We have a wonderful entrepreneurial spirit in our country. We have great creative enterprises, from entertainment to gadgetry and what have you. You'd think this would be an area where we excel. Maybe there are only two areas where we have been truly brilliant, and that would be basically The Simpsons and South Park. And maybe they could take over the U.S. government for a season, and we truly would get smart power. But what say you, Christian?
Yeah, that's a great idea. It sounds like to me. In being at State twice, the second time I was there's something called the Global Engagement Center, and after I left, it seems like they decided that their job was to actually go after fake news in America, which actually it turns out just to be news that they don't like. I'm exaggerating a little bit there, but the State Department is not up to this. The U.S. Information Agency was sort of a State Department linked thing that ran Voice of America, I believe, and maybe Radio for Europe. I'm maybe mistaking my history there. That was shut down after the end of the Cold War. The CIA got out of the political warfare business probably in the 70s. They may have had a little bit of a renaissance in the 80s, but not much. Actually, it was the AFL-CIO and the Catholic Church that did a lot of the clandestine stuff in Poland. CIA took credit for it subsequently. Maybe they deserve a little, but not a lot. It would really have to come from the White House. It would require presidential leadership. It would be less clandestine and covert in the sense of government. But clarity, saying that, we don't expect and nor do we hope for the CCP to remain in power indefinitely, that this is a government that's afraid of its own people, and trying to rally people around the globe against the party with clarity, I think is the best that we could hope for.
Well, thank you, Christian. To our audience, if you've enjoyed today's China Desk conversation, please tell your friends. Consider subscribing on YouTube or your preferred podcast platform. I want to thank you all for joining. Thank you, Christian, for sharing your perspective. Until next time, I'm Steve Yates, your host here at the China Desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.